let's talk about some of the things that are broken in our tax system. As I hear you say that a lot, our system's very badly broken. I'm not sure that I completely agree, but what do you see as the real problems that need to be fixed in the tax system?
I just think it's gotten way too complicated. There's way too many winners and losers. One argument that I've heard, which I actually don't agree with, is we sort of cleaned out the closet in '86. As you pointed out, got rid of a lot of deductions, broadened the base, lowered the rates, which is what that's all about, and we've been cluttering it up since then. It's pretty cluttered now, and I think it's gotten away too far from just collecting revenue to trying to do other things that it can't do. And then you bring in the IRS, which I think is actually starting to collapse under this system. It's impossible to administer. It's almost impossible to comply with. I just think it's not going to work very much longer that way.
Here's my concern. Here's my concern with having to think about the tax code as broken because it's too complicated. I think the sources of complexity in the tax code are from two places. One is that the economy is very complex and people figure out how to do things to game the system. And so you have a complex set of rules to treat interest-free loans as compensation, which you have to have, otherwise corporations just loan a boatload of money to their CEO at a zero rate and let the CEO invest it and get paid that way. So you have to have those kinds of rules, and they're complicated. We have them for tax shelters, and we have them for passive activities, and we have them for partnerships because people want to not pay corporate tax and have the income flow out to their individual returns instead. And then we have 3 or 4 different mechanisms to let you do that, S corporations and REITs and so forth. So there's that kind of stuff that is complex because our economy is complex. And then there's complexity that people like. It would be a lot easier to prepare my tax return if I didn't have any state and local tax deduction, I didn't have any mortgage interest deduction, I didn't have any charitable contribution deduction. I wouldn't have to find all those receipts and put all those numbers in the software. But people seem to think that's okay to have that kind of complexity, at least if it benefits them. And then we've got a lot of things actually in the code that are bad policy from an economic point of view because they subsidize activities, but aren't complex at all. I don't pay tax on my employer-provided health. It would be more complicated if that number were on my tax return and I had to, report it. I don't pay tax on municipal bond interest. It would be more complicated if I did. I get, special treatment for capital gains. Well, you simplify it and that would be easier, but people wouldn't be happy. So complexity is very much a two-edged sword.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And maybe if you take a couple points and put them together, I agree with you. The world has gotten very much more complicated. And maybe that suggests that the income tax is not the tax for the 21st century because it can't deal with a complicated economy. But the other point you raise, which is really interesting, is apparently a lot of us, including me, are willing to deal with the complexity for something like the home mortgage interest deduction or the charitable deduction. If tax reform means broadening the base and lowering the rates, then you're going to have to look at what we call in the game the tax expenditure list. And you're going to have to say to somebody, gee, maybe we ought to change that home mortgage interest deduction. And that's going to annoy a whole lot of people who, if you're the one suggesting it, and you're a politician, you don't really want. It goes back to your point about how dangerous this game is. The code has gotten so complex that in one way everybody views it as beneficial to them, even though it may not necessarily be so. So I'm thinking about, I get a home mortgage interest deduction and don't even realize I pay the alternative minimum tax, which is growing and growing and growing. They tried to fix it, but there's still more people being added to that role because I just do TurboTax, and TurboTax takes care of it for me, and I never really see it. I actually spent a couple of years, when I did know the alternative minimum tax, filling out a form called 6251. I think that's actually the title of the form. And it's a mess. If everybody who pays the alternative minimum tax had to really go through that exercise with a pencil and an eraser, I think they'd probably be picking up pitchforks and wanting to change it. So the way they've got it designed, and it's a sneaky system, as you know, the tax system is a sneaky system, you can see the benefits, but then you can't see the downside. So when they come after you, picking winners and losers, they're going to go, the people are going to go, wait a minute. No. It's the old game of don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree. And that makes tax reform really, really difficult. And I think it brings into question of, is the income tax system, which is 100 years old, I believe this year, has it run its course?
I don't think it is conceivable that the income tax system has run its course. It may be that an income tax system, the way we know it, has run its course. But if you look at other nations and you think about our deep values, we're going to insist, I believe, as a people, that folks who have more pay more. And the extent to which the system's progressive can be argued about. But I think fundamentally Americans believe that if you benefit from society, you're very successful, you ought to contribute a little more back. And the way you get that to happen is with an income tax. So the question is, can you go about simplifying the income tax? Can you do things that take a whole lot of people off the roll? Can you do things like provide a fairly generous exclusion for investment income, interest, dividends, capital gains, so that people can get those 1099s, and if they don't have a lot of that kind of income, they can just throw them away. So the biggest complexity of my tax return is finding those 1099s, because half of them come to my wife, the other half come to me, and when she gives them to me, I don't necessarily put them down where I'm supposed to. So there are some things we could do.
You raise a really fascinating point. Most people think tax is boring, and it's not. And it actually is almost a study in sociology. I think you and I agree, we've talked about it before, about progressive income taxation. And the way I was raised, and I'm a strong believer in progressive income taxation, which is that those who make more money pay a higher rate on marginal income. Because the way I was raised was, to those who have more is expected to give back. It worked when I was making very little income. I didn't pay high rates. I pay a little more now, and I'm happy to do it. I agree with you that that's deep in the culture. Or is it? Because if the income tax in a progressive system starts to change as far as being acceptable, that means our culture's changing. And this law reflects a lot of what we believe. And I think watching it over the next several years is going to be a fascinating study in our anthropology.